Hello yet again, and welcome back to allprophecyfulfilled.com on the World Wide Web. And as I always like to remind you, on Facebook, and you can find us on YouTube, simply All Prophecy Fulfilled. You can subscribe on YouTube there. Okay, we are cruising along in our series titled The ABCs of Bible Prophecy. I keep saying, we got like 2 more to go, and then I keep thinking of things to say, and I do another one. So we're going to get this done, probably 2 more. Wink, wink. Okay, today we are going to talk about apocalyptic language. Man, this is so important, and it really is an eye-opener for those who have come into fulfillment. I hope it is for you too. If I were to say apocalypse or apocalyptic, what do you think? Well, if you Google it or you go online, you're going to get a definition that says something like this. Apocalypse, describing or prophesying the complete destruction of the world. End of the world, momentous or catastrophic event. Okay, so when we say apocalypse today, this is how we tend to think. We think end of the world, planet Earth, universe, pandemonium, the Antichrist is coming, worldwide destruction, chaos, and so on and so forth. Well, you know what? I think this is simply a product of our times and our Western way of thinking, to be honest with you. The irony is this. The Greek word apocalypsis, as in the apocalypsis or the revelation of Jesus Christ, it means to reveal or unveil or maybe even uncover. So the intention was to make known that which God actually wanted to make known, and in such a way that the original audience could have understand what was being revealed to them. Here's the sad part. Here's the ironic part, really. With our newspaper exegesis and our anything goes type of approach to prophecy and how we read it, we have essentially, I think, revealed that which was supposed to be unveiled. We have just made a complicated, confusing mess out of it. Why? Well, I think it's because we've misunderstood biblical, prophetic, apocalyptic language. And we need to get back to allowing the Bible to define the terms for us, if we're going to understand biblical prophecy at all. The Old Testament prophets used what we might consider very fantastic, imaginative, figurative, hyperbolic, metaphorical, symbolic language to convey ideas. So in other words, they use real physical things in the physical world, and they use those things to represent ideas and concepts. Okay, and we see this like just right out of the gate, right in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 37, I know you're familiar with the story, but you remember Jacob and his sons, and his son Joseph was having some dreams, wasn't he? And he says in 37:9, he says, he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers, and he said, look, I've dreamed another dream. And this time, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Now, do you think his brothers or his father were confused at all what was meant by this dream? No, they weren't confused. How does his dad respond? He says, shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? Now, that's interesting. I mean, he knew exactly who the sun was, exactly who the moon was, and he knew exactly who those 11 stars were. Interesting, huh? So here's what I'm getting at. This kind of language, it is just peppered all throughout the Old Testament. Let me give you an example. This would be almost a classic example. A lot of people use this one, but I'm going to use it because it works and it's true. It's accurate. Isaiah chapter 13. Here we have a clear judgment upon Babylon, judgment of or a burden against Babylon. And we know it's absolutely true. In fact, it couldn't be more clear in verse 17. He says, behold, I will stir up the Medes against them. He says in Babylon, verse 19, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. There's no question what this is about. So how does Isaiah and God, if you will, how do they describe or depict this particular judgment against Babylon? Well, let's read. In verse 6, he says, well, for the day of the Lord is at hand. Sounds like it was soon. No duh. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. He says in verse 9, behold, the day of the Lord comes. Interesting, day of the Lord. What's the day of the Lord? It's a judgment upon a nation carried out by another nation. That's the day of the Lord. Listen to what he says, verse 10, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. I will punish the world for its evil. What world that is? The entire world? No, I'd say it's the world of Babylon is what I'd say. He goes on to say in verse 13, therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will be moved out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. Now that, my friends, is apocalyptic language. Now, do you think that the actual stars, the physical stars, actually came crashing down, or that the actual sun actually went dark, or the moon didn't give its light? No, you don't think that. You know that's not true. You know that he is speaking hyperbolically, figuratively. There's so many words we could use there. We know that. Okay then. Well, what about when we get, fast forward, what about when we get to a passage like Matthew chapter 24? Well, what's the context there? Well, you probably know that the context, that which is being spoken of, is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple along with it. It is a judgment upon Jerusalem, specifically Old Covenant Jerusalem. That's the context. So how is that depicted? How is that described? What does Jesus say about that? Well, right in the middle of it, around verse 29, he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, where do you suppose Jesus got that language from? Here's how I kind of want you to think about this. This might be helpful, it might not. Let's call all of the long line of Old Testament prophets, let's call those the little p's. Now, what I mean by that is they're the little prophets. All the little p's were looking forward to, pointing towards, prophesying of the big P, the big prophet, the Messiah, and his kingdom. Make sense? So, I mean, this is just really a simple concept. Let's use some logic here. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus lived in the first century. Jesus was a prophet. Okay, well, as such, Jesus naturally, he thought like a first century Jew. He talked like a first century Jew. And he communicated like a first century Jew, specifically a first century Jewish prophet. It's not as though the New Testament comes along, Jesus comes along, and all of a sudden he starts speaking differently than all the other prophets. Is that as if he changes his mode of prophetic communication? I mean, let's get real. Jesus would have naturally used the exact kind of language and in the exact same way that countless prophets before him did. I have referenced Isaiah 13 and Matthew 24. Luke 21 is the parallel to Matthew 24. So I'm going to pop over to Luke 21 real quick, and I want to show you something. I was watching a YouTube the other night, and a pastor, a preacher by the name of Jack Hibbs was preaching in Luke 21, and he was talking about the preterist view. And he was referencing verse 25 of Matthew 21. He says, and I'll read that to you. It says, "And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth, distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring." Well, here's what Mr. Hibbs had to say about that. I'm going to quote here. He says, "Yes, it began with the destruction of the temple, but look at verse 25. There will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth, the distress of nations with no way out, the sea and the waves roaring." That never happened. There's no record of history where the world was freaking out over bizarre, horrific terrors in the atmosphere. Then he goes on to say, now we see Jesus fast forwards to the time of the end, which, by the way, is answered in Revelation 15 through 19. It's awesome. It's coming. He concludes by saying, we have a better understanding if we just slow down and read the Bible. Folks, don't read books on the Bible. Read the Bible. You know, there's so much wrong with what he said, to be honest with you. I don't even know where to start. Mr. Hibbs is not considering the apocalyptic style, which is using real physical, visible realities or entities to paint a picture or convey a message. When an army would rapidly approach, now think about this for a second. What might one see from one's perspective? Well, perhaps they would see clouds or pillars of dust that look like smoke by the multitude of the approaching horses. Or how might a pillaged city or a destroyed city, how might that look after or even during that destruction? Would it look like burning ruins of fire with clouds of dark smoke rising up, darkening the sun possibly? Or causing the moon to turn red? Yeah, are you starting to see the picture here? Also, I mean, Mr. Hibbs, he ignores the testimony, I think, and the precedent set, like in Genesis that I demonstrated, of how prophetic language can be symbolic. You know, just like in the case of Joseph, the sun, the moon, the stars, so here too. I mean, could not Jesus simply be conveying the downfall and destruction of the then standing religious powers, if you will, or entities, the overthrow of a spiritual ruling system, or the shaking down or the removal of the powers of heaven so that a new heaven and earth could emerge? Does that make sense? What Mr. Hibbs does here is he totally ignores the context, cutting off verse, say, 25 through 27. What he does is he takes verse 25 and 27 and he lifts those out of the passage and he thrusts them forward into a time that's future to us. And that's just not viable, and that's just not responsible. And in so doing that, he totally ignores the importance of audience relevance and the many time statements set forth in the text. So essentially, what Mr. Hibbs is doing here is he's jumping back and forth from a first century audience to a later audience. How confusing would that be for those who are listening to Jesus? So look, I mean, Jack Hibbs, he's right about one thing. He says, you know, we have to read our Bibles. You know what? I agree with that. But you know what? We have to read all of our Bibles, the old and the new. I mean, I guess that's really my point, and that's what I'm getting at. If we're going to understand prophetic literature, in addition to incorporating or utilizing all of these interpretive principles that we're talking about, we have to read all of our scriptures, recognizing that Old Testament literature or language, really that sets the precedent for some of these things that we see in the New Testament. And do you know what? To ignore that, I think, is just to really, it's to head into the New Testament really flying blind. And that's not a responsible thing to do. So I would recommend going to my website, allprophecyfulfilled.com. If this is new stuff to you, there's a tab there, and it says Old Testament language, words mean things. And that would just be a great place to start, to begin looking at these ideas, these words, these phrases that are used in such a way and carried over into the New Testament writing. So I hope this made sense. I felt like I rambled a little bit there, but man, there was so much to say. Apocalyptic language, it is foundational to our understanding Bible prophecy. So again, hey, thanks for joining me. I'm going to get out of here. I went too long. I'm trying so hard to keep these under 10 minutes, but I just can't do it, and I'm sorry, but haven't figured that one out yet. So take care. See you later. See you on the next one. Adios. Bye-bye.